In The Boys, heroism is not only a public promise, it is a product category with a margin, a launch calendar, and a risk profile. That framing sets the show apart because it treats power as inventory, not as myth. The crucial insight is simple. When power becomes inventory, the company that owns it learns to sell the feeling of safety as a service. Vought's clearest move is portfolio thinking. The 7 is a flagship line, curated for national appeal and stacked with expensive talent. Around it, the company deploys regional heroes, like mid-tier products tuned to local tastes. This is market segmentation in superhero form. The logic is familiar from consumer goods. Concentrate budget and attention on a halo brand, then let lower tiers carry volume across niches. That structure explains behavior that might otherwise look like ego or chaos. If a hero's scandal threatens the flagship, the company contains it faster than a regional mishap. The reason is straightforward. Flagship brands anchor licensing, box office, and synergy. They act as the face that keeps every other product line credible. That is why so much narrative oxygen in the show flows back to the 7. The business math demands it. To see the business stack, follow the money the way Vought does. The company films glossy universe movies because films sell a unifying story, and stories sell everything else. Toy lines, apparel, fragrances, energy drinks, and theme park tie-ins draw their legitimacy from that central narrative. Live appearances and charity events look like goodwill, but they function as lead generation. They keep the brand familiar and reduce friction when the next product launches. Even the social media clips matter. Short videos, controlled interviews, and stage-managed rescues create a constant drip feed of signals. This is data-driven targeting disguised as devotion. Every post is an A/B test in the wild. If engagement jumps, that angle becomes the next storyline. The company uses our reactions to refine the product we think we discovered. That detail reveals how the show thinks about modern influence. Heroes are not only fighters, they are influencers with production budgets, and that makes a difference. A real-world survey landscape shows that a large share of young people are willing to post sponsored content if the price is right. In other words, the pipeline between admiration and promotion is now short. The Boys turns that reality into corporate policy. Admiration is captured, measured, and monetized. Public relations in this world is not a coat of paint. It is risk insurance. The work is not only to make heroes look good. It is to make harm look explainable. NDAs and settlements in the show play like routine paperwork. That is the point. Normalize the settlement, and you transform scandal into a line item. A lawsuit becomes a budgetable expense. The cost of making truth quiet becomes as predictable as the cost of marketing a summer blockbuster. This helps explain why the company seems calm when something awful happens. And the PR team already has its crisis choreography ready. They know which outlets will carry a sympathetic angle, which talking heads will appear on friendly networks, and which phrases test well in focus groups. In practice, that choreography acts like a firewall protecting the brand's asset value. The hero's body is replaceable if the brand story survives. The image manufacturing is not an afterthought. It is the manufacturing. Costumes are redesigned to broadcast purity or edge. Slogans are written to stick inside a news chyron. Personal storylines are trimmed like advertising copy, down to the tragedy that sells. When Starlight's costume becomes less about function and more about market appeal, the show is not only critiquing sexism, it is showing how appeal is measured and enforced at scale. Focus groups aren't only there to validate what the company already believes. They are a tool for shaping belief. If most people prefer a simple narrative arc over a complicated one, then the complicated truth becomes a business risk. That is how narrative filters become moral filters. And here the show overlaps with Herman and Chomsky's argument about media. Ownership and advertiser dependence. Do not tell editors what to print line by line. They create incentives to favor stories that align with the owner's interests and the advertiser's comfort. Inside The Boys, we see a fictional version of that system operating without apology. Vought produces the story and owns the platform. It then sells advertising against the story of safety. The closer the hero brand aligns with national identity, the more untouchable it becomes in mainstream channels. That is not because conspiracy censors live in every newsroom. It is because the company's strategic position shapes the boundaries of what looks responsible to air. Look at the synergy. Vought's news arm echoes entertainment's framing. Entertainment clips feed the news cycle, and news coverage validates the entertainment. This loop looks accidental if you only see pieces. The show treats it as an engineered circuit. That circuit is powerful. It stabilizes demand by making product loyalty feel like civic loyalty. What matters here is the revenue stack that hides inside the story. Films and shows drive merchandise. Merchandise drives visibility. Visibility drives ad rates and platform subscriptions. Each tier amplifies the next. From a distance, it looks like culture. Up close, it is vertical integration, perfected. The same logic explains why the company defends certain heroes beyond reason. Their brand is a keystone of the whole structure. When disaster hits, the game turns to liability management. Settlements and NDAs are cheaper than allowing the flagship brand to collapse. Legal mechanisms are not only shields, they are management tools that convert uncertainty into cost-controlled outcomes. Corporate law scholars have long noted that the corporate form can diffuse responsibility while preserving control. The show dramatizes that with chilling efficiency. Decisions feel consequential, yet the people who bear harm do not receive equal voice in the narrative that follows. The term externality helps name what we are seeing. An externality is a cost pushed onto someone who did not choose it. In The Boys, collateral damage is an externality of the hero business. The brand harvests the upside, while the public absorbs the downside. In a shareholder-first environment, that imbalance is predictable, not accidental. The machine is doing what it was built to do. Brand safety, a term marketers use, becomes public safety's substitute. If the brand feels safe, the public is told the world is safer. That substitution works because the company can measure brand safety, while real safety is messy. The temptation to prefer what can be measured is one of the oldest management habits. The show invites us to watch that habit at scale. Market segmentation deserves one more pass. Regional heroes aren't only about geography, they are about identity. Put a hero in the right costume, with the right cause, and you gain access to a demographic that might distrust your flagship. This is political micro-targeting wearing a cape. It trains audiences to see their values reflected back, then steers those values toward consumption. The company applies the same logic to narrative risk. Characters who can be steered into profitable arcs are promoted. Those who cannot be controlled are isolated or recast in the public eye. That pattern mirrors how real organizations favor predictable employees over principled outliers. It is not malice in every case. It is risk management disguised as meritocracy. Why does Herman and Chomsky's framework matter here? Because the show builds a fictional example of their filters. Ownership gives Vought the incentive to maintain the status quo that shelters its profits. Advertising, within the show's media ecosystem, favors content that reassures sponsors. Sourcing leans on official hero communications, because independent reporting is costly and risky. Flack, in the form of coordinated backlash, punishes dissenting voices, and an overarching ideology frames the heroes as embodiments of national virtue. Filter by filter, a complex world is rendered safe for the product. The subtle punchline is that consent here is manufactured not for a war, but for a brand. Yet the technique is familiar. The lesson travels. If you can manufacture consent for who counts as a hero, you can shape attitudes about who deserves extraordinary leeway. That leeway is political power by another route. Public relations completes the circuit by converting narrative dominance into forgiveness. When a scandal cannot be hidden, the team reframes it as growth. Redemption arcs are not only human stories, they are financial instruments. They buy time for a brand to recover and for the next product cycle to arrive. Each apology is also a content event. The more compelling the contrition, the more efficient the recovery. Even the legal threats carry story logic. Lawsuits become battles against opportunists, not remedies for hurt people. That rhetorical move isolates critics while inviting loyalists to rally. In practice, it turns accountability into an identity test. The Boys shows how well that tactic works when your face is on lunchboxes. There is also the quiet power of the boardroom. Herman's earlier work on corporate control reminds us that when ownership sits close to media power, strategic oversight can align markets and messages. Boards filled with corporate and banking executives tend to defend a stable business climate. In the show's world, that climate is one where heroes are profitable and critics are marginal. Stability here does not mean safety. It means predictability for investors. All of this engineering would collapse without demand. So Vought manufactures demand by making heroes emotionally indispensable. The trick is to conflate the product with the feeling. You do not buy a movie ticket. You buy the assurance that someone capable will show up when trouble starts. That assurance is persuasive because it answers a real need. People want safety. The company sells a version that fits a schedule. What happens to truth inside this machine becomes the episode's open question. If a truth cannot be monetized, it will be softened, segmented, or ignored. That is not because no one cares. It is because every function in the system, from marketing to legal, is rewarded for protecting revenue. The dissonance only appears when the cost of silence accumulates in public view. This is where the show becomes most useful as a map. It treats every glossy panel and triumphant poster as a design choice serving cost control. Nothing is inevitable. Everything is optimized. Talent is chosen not only for skill, but for pliability. Storylines are extended not only for art, but for average revenue per user. When seen through that lens, hero stops being a moral category and becomes a business classification. The most unsettling implication is that admiration itself is a resource. Mine it carefully enough, and you never run out of material. The show puts us in front of that conveyor belt. It invites us to ask how often we reward the conveyor, because it feels like care. That tension will carry us into the next section, where we will follow the money through the crisis pipeline and watch how externalities multiply, while the brand stays clean. For now, hold one model in mind. The hero is a portfolio asset. The 7 is the flagship line. Regional heroes are segmented products. Revenue flows through films, licensing, endorsements, and live events. Public relations functions as risk insurance. Legal structures convert harm into settlements and silence. Image design is manufacturing. Media filters select which stories survive. If that model is right, then the question is no longer whether a hero is good or bad. It is whether the system rewards the truth we need or the story that sells. That distinction matters because it travels beyond fiction. The same tools that build Vought's machine, branding discipline, media ownership links, advertiser-friendly narratives, crisis containment, are routine in the real world. We see them whenever influence is concentrated and accountability is expensive. We will use that continuity to test each part of the model against real incentives as we go. This is not a call to cynicism. It is a call to literacy. If we can name the moving parts, then admiration can be a choice instead of a reflex. And if admiration is a choice, then heroism must compete with honesty, not only with spectacle. That is the standard a public deserves when power is packaged as a product. In the next chapter, we will open the crisis playbook and follow the incentives to their natural end. Branding begins with a simple move. Take raw power and give it a name, a face, and a shape that can be printed on anything. In The Boys, Vought does this with relentless precision. Homelander's flag cape, a train's electric blue, Starlight's gold star. All of it forms an architecture meant to travel. A good brand architecture solves a coordination problem. It lets hundreds of designers, marketers, and licensees keep the same identity legible across films, cereal boxes, talk shows, and theme park rides. That detail reveals how the company reduces friction and increases certainty. If every touchpoint looks and sounds the same, consumers spend less effort deciding who this hero is and what they stand for. The important point is not just aesthetics, but operational control. A logo, a colorway, and a catchphrase are governance tools that tell people downstream what they can and cannot do with the character. In practice, those constraints protect the asset. The show also illustrates a quieter truth. A superhero is an allegory of intellectual property. Scholars of media franchising have argued that a hero's identity signals continuity, while the owners revise the character to chase markets. That is why the costume can change, but the icon on the chest stays. The Boys plays with this by highlighting reshoots, costume makeovers, and posture shifts that always leave the brand's spine intact. What mattered here was demonstrating stability while optimizing for sales. Catchphrases carry the same logic. They compress an attitude into a shareable cue. When a character says a signature line, it is more than flavor. It teaches the audience how to repeat the brand on their own feeds. Girls Get It Done functions this way in The Boys. It packages women's empowerment as a rally line, then reroutes that effect into merch and cross-promotion. This helps explain why slogans are tested as rigorously as action scenes. They are reproducible energy. The palette, pose, and phrase then connect to a library of moves. You can see it in a train's sprints and camera-ready touchdowns. Action becomes choreography, and choreography becomes a template for clips, gifs, and toys. That pipeline exists because mimetic clarity turns attention into revenue. It also creates a floor for crisis response. When a scandal hits, the brand's core signals remain, giving PR something to anchor back to. Consistency cushions turbulence. Transmedia synergy tightens this system. The in-universe film franchise Dawn of the Seven sits at the center of a whole orbit of songs, interviews, and behind-the-scenes reels. The show makes that orbit visible to explain a simple feedback rule. Every new platform is both a billboard and a data collector. The content promotes the hero, and the clicks report back on what worked. That loop is not artistic flourish. It is a measurement device disguised as entertainment. Then comes the twist. In The Boys, a crisis does not pause the transmedia machine. It fuels it. Scandal becomes script fodder. A character's off-screen misdeed reappears as an on-screen redemption arc, or a rewritten scene in the film. This is not just satire about Hollywood. It explains how synergy treats harm as narrative energy. If an apology tour makes viewers click more, the content unit grows, and the quarterly plan counts that growth as success. The brand adapts, the pipeline hums. To keep that hum on message, companies use a crisis playbook. The steps look mechanical because they are. First, frame the event fast. Whoever defines terms early sets the range of acceptable interpretations. In the show, Vought pushes phrases like isolated incident and ongoing investigation because those words move the story away from systemic critique. They buy time and shift attention to a manageable scale. A small story is easier to own. Second, deploy a holding statement in the face. A sincere, modest acknowledgement often beats over-explanation. The Boys satirizes this with staged apologies that hit the same beats. Regret, commitment to growth, and a pledge to listen. The format is not accidental. It is engineered to satisfy newsroom requirements, while revealing as little liability as possible. In practice, it also primes the audience to look for emotional closure rather than forensic detail. Third, choose selective disclosures. Companies release facts that sound substantive, but seal the pipeline where it matters. In the show, Vought reveals slivers around botched operations or misconduct, while containing the explosive truth of compound V for as long as possible. That method channels outrage into a safer vent. It also prevents lawyers and regulators from getting documents that would expose systemic design choices. The disclosure is real, but it is not the whole story. Fourth, activate third-party validators. The Boys uses morning shows, fan expos, and religious stages, the Believe Expo and the Church of the Collective as credibility laundries. This works because endorsement by someone outside the company feels like independent judgment. In reality, these validators are often entangled through access deals or mutual promotion needs. When a talk show gets an exclusive, scrutiny bends toward keeping that relationship alive. The validator becomes part of the brand's perimeter defense. Here, media incentives matter. Critics of media ownership patterns have long observed that when news sits inside conglomerates, house priorities seep into coverage. The show's fake news segments, glossy press junkets, and coordinated rollouts capture that gravity. It is not that every journalist receives a memo, but that access and synergy create habits. If you want the next big interview or trailer debut, you keep the escalator moving. Scrutiny that threatens the pipeline gets deprioritized. Manufacturing consent is a large claim, but one mechanism is mundane. Boards and executives hold overlapping interests across entertainment and news divisions. That structural overlap favors stability and assets safety. In the Boys' world, Vought's executives treat the news desk as both a megaphone and a risk surface. That detail helps explain why soft interviews land during turbulent weeks. It is a way to shape the terms before adversarial venues can. Agenda setting migrates to friendlier rooms. Narrative reframing completes the toolkit. When a pattern threatens to look systemic, shift the cause. The show is explicit about this with the super-terrorist arc. A diffuse problem, unregulated powered individuals, gets recast as a foreign threat that justifies expanded budgets and security theater. It is a classic pivot. Reframing turns fear into an argument for the provider's growth. The same story that might have cut funding becomes a sales deck for new programs. Fans sit at the meeting point between branding and PR. Their attention is a buffer and a sensor. Social theory helps here. As media scholar Christian Fuchs explains, users on commercial platforms perform unpaid labor. Their posts and clicks generate data that platforms sell to advertisers. The Boys updates that idea for the franchise era. When fans boost hashtags, duet videos, or share apologies with commentary, they are doing targeting work at no cost to the brand. Their labor maps segments. This helps explain why campaigns lean on easy-to-reproduce symbols and prompts. A hashtag like Girls Get It Done is not just a vibe. It is a query that pulls back a live sample of the audience's mood. That stream becomes a dashboard. The brand learns which lines travel and which faces drive watch time. Then it tunes creative choices to those signals. Pleasure becomes a workshop for the next quarter's slate. The fans feel heard because in one sense they are. Their behavior is the brief. The show hints at a darker parallel using pop culture echoes. The old fable of boys lured to Pleasure Island to become donkeys was a metaphor for indulgence turning into labor. In the social feed era, that logic restages itself. Your share sells you. The sin is not fun. It is unpaid work. The Boys brings this home by weaving corporate influencer culture into hero worship. Crisis clips travel because they entertain, and they teach the machine which apology styles monetize best. Merchandising aligns these pieces with demographics. Research on superhero franchises notes a long-standing tilt toward young men as heavy buyers of ancillary goods. In practice, that insight shapes creative decisions. The Boys parodies this with action-first beats and locker room humor that double as toy fodder. At the same time, the company tests expansions into other segments. Queen Maeve's identity becomes a marketing vector to court LGBTQ audiences. The representation is real, and the segmentation is profitable. This is not a condemnation of representation. It is an explanation of how it gets budgeted. When a corporation forecasts demand, it does not weigh values abstractly. It weighs predicted sales and halo effects. The brand's social positions become part of its portfolio mix. That is why the same company that drapes a hero in progressive slogans might also fund a security bill that curtails dissent. The calculation asks one question: does this posture increase long-term valuation? We also see the press influence side from the audience's seat. Access usually arrives through cheerful packages, late-night skits, set visits, and exclusive reveals. These pipelines do not exist to deceive. They exist to sustain the machine that prints reliable attention. The trade, however, has consequences. When coverage incentives tilt towards synergy, critical distance narrows. The audience receives more story about the story and less reporting on the system. That absence is a key input in PR strategy. The Boys illustrates containment through law as well as language. Non-disclosure agreements, settlements with victims, and friendly prosecutors form a shadow channel. PR behaves publicly to shape opinion. Legal teams work privately to cap liability. The coordination matters. A strong apology without airtight NDAs invites discovery. Ironclad paperwork without a credible narrative invites backlash. The company pursues both, not out of malice, but because dual containment reduces variance. Predictability attracts capital. Even here, crisis becomes content. When the studio reshoots Dawn of the Seven to erase a scandalous director, the correction markets itself. The press cycle sells reform. The new cut is branded as progress, and the behind-the-scenes nightmare is translated into a consumer choice at the box office. That is the logic of synergy under duress. It uses the audience's desire for better behavior to sell the replacement product. The public is offered closure in the shape of a purchase. Choreography and cinematography become brand guidelines. The Boys shows how spectacle is standardized. Low angles for godlike figures, close-ups for sincerity, eye-level handoffs for team unity. These choices are not only creative, they are repeatable patterns for vendors and partners. A consistent look tells toy makers what to sculpt and streamers what thumbnail to feature. That shared grammar cuts coordination costs and expands the surface area where the brand can appear without confusion. A data layer stitches this together. Feedback loops test everything. Focus groups react to costumes and arcs, just as dashboards track whether apology videos recover engagement. The sequence is simple: change, measure, lock in, and scale. Starlight's costume adjustments in the series reflect that process. The alteration chases a demographic and a platform trend. The lesson is not that authenticity dies. It is that authenticity must register on a chart to outcompete another option, because marketing sits inside the same box. A hero's charity gala or faith-based appearance does real fundraising. It also performs alignment. The audience infers values from venue. The Boys treats the Believe Expo as both community theater and capture mechanism. The point is not hypocrisy for its own sake. It is segmentation. Each cause unlocks a corridor of donors, voters, and viewers who might not be reachable through straight action branding. Philanthropy becomes a distribution channel. Redemption arcs use third-party institutions to reset public memory. The Deep's rehabilitation through a church shows the laundering function. A credible outsider pronounces remorse sincere. That pronouncement gives entertainment media something to cover instead of the original harm. The cycle does not erase consequences, but it changes the index of stories. Redemption packages better than litigation. In the attention economy, that packaging matters more than closure for those harmed. Externalities pile up in the margins. When a plane goes down or a neighborhood is collateral damage, the brand moves to triage perception first. The reason is brutal arithmetic. Revenue is legible quickly, while costs often appear slowly through lawsuits, medical bills, and quiet suffering. If the company can get past the first 48 hours with the story contained, the data shows the crisis curve might decay before the ledger fully reflects harm. The machine is optimized for that decay. Here, the mid-story hook returns. If the story moves the product, what moves the story? In the series, executives like Stan Edgar answer with a discipline that sounds dull because it works. The quarterly plan sets the rhythm. Budgets, renewals, and market windows drive which beats land when. That is why some truths wait for a controlled leak date, and some arcs accelerate to meet earnings season. The narrative is a balance sheet with costumes. What this reveals is not a conspiracy, but a system tuned to investor expectations. Public companies trade on predictability. The branding machine exists to produce predictable attention from unpredictable events. PR exists to compress volatility. A hero's identity is the ballast, and every apology, reshoot, and campaign is a trim tab. The engine accepts fuel from scandal as readily as from triumph, because both spike attention. It cares that the spike can be steered and measured. The audience lives inside that steering. The feeds they use to talk back are the same channels that score their reactions. The company studies both critique and praise as signals of where to go next. That does not mean viewers have no agency. It means agency enters through the transaction layer of visibility. In practice, pressure that threatens distribution or advertiser relationships moves faster than moral appeals alone. Knowing that difference changes how one reads the show and the world it mirrors. The last thread in this section ties back to brand safety. In The Boys, brand safety often masquerades as public safety. The wording is not accidental. If an image is compromised, the argument goes, operational effectiveness will suffer. That fusion licenses extraordinary power to shape narratives about harm, accountability, and reform. It also blurs the line between what protects people and what protects quarterly guidance. The blur is the point. It keeps the brand moving. None of this erases heroism. It explains how corporate systems package it. The architecture gives power a face. The playbook gives it a parachute. The platforms turn fandom into a factory that runs on feeling. You can admire the show's wit and still see the manual underneath. Once you see it, you cannot unsee how often harm becomes content, and apology becomes a form of market research. That recognition is a form of safety too, if it sharpens your reading of the next exclusive. The question that now presses forward is about the costs we do not see. When a brand survives a crisis and revenue rises, where did the harm go? Who carried it? And how was it kept off the books long enough to spare the quarter? The Boys does not answer with a lecture. It walks us into the liability channel where reputation, law, and money braid together. In that corridor, you learn which stories are allowed to ripen and which are quietly bought for parts. Step into Vaught's balance sheet, and an omission explains the show's unsettling pattern. The civilians caught in the blast do not appear as a cost unless a lawsuit ripens into something measurable. That is not a glitch in bookkeeping. It is how corporate law and accounting define responsibility. Profit is recorded. Harms to outsiders are not, unless they become the company's legal problem. In The Boys, that gap widens with spectacle. It is the space where collateral damage turns into somebody else's bill, and growth goes on. Economists and corporate law scholars have a word for those missing entries: externalities. It means the costs of corporate actions that land on third parties who never consented to the deal. Janice Sarah puts it plainly in the Anglo-American framework. Officers must weigh costs to the corporation, short-term and long, but not to anyone else. Damage to workers, small creditors, consumers, and communities sits outside the ledger. That is why a poisoned river can coexist with a rising stock price. The river's pain is not booked. Milton Friedman, whose shareholder-first logic still shapes boardrooms, gave an even simpler definition. An externality is the effect of a transaction on a third party who did not consent or participate. That framing matters because it narrows what counts as the firm's duty. If harm to outsiders is conceptually other people's problem, managers are rewarded for shifting costs away. The system praises anyone who can keep upside inside the company and push downside into the world. In practice, that is what the boys keep showing. Look at how Vought classifies disaster. A botched rescue is not a strategy pivot. It is a public relations event with a legal tail. The budgets that swell after the blast are marketing, crisis team overtime, and maybe actuarial reserves. What you do not see is a permanent retooling of incentives that would threaten performance metrics tied to revenue, screen time, and franchise synergy. The important point is that the internal scoreboard pays for attention, not for safety that would slow the machine. This helps explain why rising power, rising harm, and rising profits can march together. If the danger produces bigger headlines, and the headlines move merchandise, the risk feels like fuel rather than friction. The downside is kept elsewhere through settlements, intimidation, and paperwork. A payout with a non-disclosure agreement converts a public failure into a private line item. It buys silence and blocks copycat claims. From the CFO's view, that is cheaper than redesigning a hero's protocol and admitting systematic fault. Real companies have run this math. In 1999, a Los Angeles jury returned a record $4.9 billion award against General Motors over a fuel tank design that burned people alive after a crash. The verdict ballooned because a decades-old internal memo suggested the company had weighed fixes against likely claims. The detail matters less than the mechanism. Costs from injuries did not appear on the books until discovery and trial forced recognition. Before then, they lived outside the balance sheet. That timing is crucial. Accounting records expenses that are probable and reasonably, everything else stays in the footnotes as a contingent liability, or not at all. So the firm can trumpet margin growth while the community carries uncertainty. This is not malpractice by the accountants. It is the rule set, and rule sets shape behavior. Managers aim at what is counted, and they discount what is not. In a world built on quarterly reporting, the invisible quarter wins again and again. Shareholder primacy tightens the loop. Friedman's view, popularized in boardrooms, says the corporation's job is to maximize shareholder wealth. That culture raises the bar for any choice that would sacrifice short-term profit to reduce external harm. The business judgment rule gives managers discretion, but the social expectation is clear. Play it safe for the share price. Stock-based pay then amplifies the pressure. When compensation swings with near-term market reaction, the cheapest fix beats the durable solution, especially if the durable solution admits culpability. In The Boys, we watch that logic play out as policy. Collateral damage becomes a media talking point, not an operating constraint. The internal targets that matter are ratings, merchandise lift, and policy wins like new market access. Even catastrophes are mined for leverage. The failed airline rescue is not grounds for retreat. It becomes a pitch for military contracts, a bid to scale the business model. That is shareholder primacy expressed through plot. Risk is tolerated when scale promises higher future cash flows. Settlements and non-disclosure agreements sit at the heart of the externalizing machine. They transform diffuse, reputationally dangerous stories into isolated private obligations. A check is written. Silence is signed. No precedent is set in the culture. The company avoids discovery that could surface patterns and trigger public oversight. For managers, the attraction is straightforward. Structural change is permanent and contagious. It affects every deal tomorrow. A confidential settlement is contained and forgettable. That difference keeps the ledger clean and the flywheel turning. There is another filter between harm and accountability. Insurance. Big firms carry layers of liability coverage and often self-insure with captive subsidiaries. Premiums spread risk across time and space, and that diffusion changes behavior. If the insurer swallows part of the loss, prevention looks less urgent. In theory, underwriters push back by demanding safety standards. In practice, market power matters. A company the size of Vought can negotiate lenient terms or keep risk in-house, preserving freedom to chase spectacle while buffering against catastrophic payouts. This is why legal victories against corporations feel both dramatic and strangely late. The General Motors award landed after decades of design, production, and crashes. Enron's collapse came only when its own concealment finally devoured shareholder wealth. Wow. Those moments punish, but they do not rewind the externalities already distributed to workers, creditors, and communities. The important point is not just that accountability arrives slowly. It arrives through channels that recognize harm only after it converts into the company's liability, which is the narrowest portion. Bring that lens back to Vought's dashboards. What gets tracked becomes the culture. Crime-fighting tallies, social sentiment, and merchandising velocity are the daily pulse. Civilian harm data, if collected at all, lives in a legal silo to preserve privilege. That asymmetry makes sense once you accept the accounting frame. If a metric cannot improve the next quarter's revenue, it rarely earns screen time at the executive table. The result is a strange optimization. The system trims reputational risk, but it does not reduce danger. You can hear the same logic in the language of best efforts. A company promises to improve training, increase oversight, and refresh values. Those steps sound concrete, but they are soft controls that rarely alter payout math. When a policy does not change the path of cash, it is mostly a message to audiences who supply demand, regulators who watch headlines, and investors who price sentiment. And that's performative compliance. It offers relief without restructuring incentives. In the boys, it keeps the 7 marketable. Why not fix the root cause anyway? Because structural change compounds through time and discovery. Redesigning a product or rewriting a protocol can imply prior fault. That inference invites class actions, regulatory scrutiny, and a cascade of similar claims. Confidential settlements, by contrast, contain both cost and story. The confidentiality severs the line between cases, so plaintiffs cannot coordinate as easily. That detail reveals how the law's architecture, meant to protect fairness, can also fragment accountability. Fragmentation lowers the expected price of harm. The show's corporate workflow teaches another lesson about incentives. Spectacle and scale are complementary goods. Bigger stunts raise attention, which lifts licensing, which funds even bigger stunts. Safety investments look like speed bumps in that flywheel. Unless a regulator or a court changes the calculus, the cheapest path remains to budget for occasional blowback. That helps explain why we see repeat patterns instead of course correction. The system is not broken. It is performing as designed under a narrow definition of cost. There is also a calendar effect. Quarterly earnings compress time horizons. Safety benefits, by definition, unfold across long arcs with no single headline to capture them. That makes investment cases harder to defend internally. A new fight choreography protocol, a slower helicopter approach, or a second verification step all prevent events that do not happen. The accounting term for that is opportunity cost. The cultural term is thankless. Unless leadership prices that prevention explicitly, the inertia drifts back to the visible wins that please markets. The boys lingers on one more lever: control of information. If you can own the footage, schedule the interview, and write the apology, you narrow the window where independent facts set the price of failure. That is why the company cares so much about chain of custody for evidence, and why it isolates victims. Control over narrative is not just vanity. It is risk management. Every day a story stays inside the corporate perimeter is a day the financial obligation can still be contained. So what could force change before disaster? Historically, three mechanisms matter. First, regulation can reset which costs belong on the corporate side of the line. Second, tort law can make future harms more probable and more estimable, which moves them onto the ledger earlier. Third, countervailing institutions, unions, investigative media, civil society can raise the reputational price fast enough to affect nearer-term revenue. The show hints at each, but it also shows how large firms anticipate them and build buffers to delay the bite. That monitoring architecture is visible in the cadence of Vought's responses. When a scandal breaks, the first move is not to fix the hazard. It is to narrow the category. Was this a rogue actor, a unique situation, a context misunderstood by the public? Narrowing works because law and policy punish patterns more than anomalies. If you can keep a case from joining others, you keep regulators from rewriting the baseline. The term of art is issue containment. Its outcome is stalled reform. Notice also how performance targets create plausible deniability. If a hero's bonus depends on arrests and saves, not on avoided harm, management can say it simply rewarded results. The design of metrics launders responsibility. It allows executives to claim neutrality while steering behavior toward risk. That detail tells us something important about governance. You do not need to order harm to profit from it. You only need to write a scorecard that ignores the casualties and celebrates the spectacle that sells. Externalities are not an academic footnote here. They are the core operating advantage of any firm that can move fast, capture attention, and defer recognition of damage. In that sense, The Boys is not only satire, it is a case study in cost design. The corporation performs to the line the law draws. Everything beyond that line becomes a community subsidy. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The strength of the business rests on the weakness of the accounting boundary. Pause on one practical question the show keeps raising. Who, exactly, pays for the learning curve of power? When a new ability debuts and goes wrong, the benefits accrue to the brand, the platform, and the investors who own the asset. The costs land on neighbors, bystanders, and first responders. That divergence matters because it answers why reform is so hard. The payers lack the control. The controllers do not experience the price. Without a mechanism to knit them together, drift wins. That brings us back to the question we planted earlier. If costs are invisible until after the fact, and if the firm is rewarded for keeping them that way, what forces a pivot before catastrophe? The show's answer is a moving target. Whistleblowers, political shifts, insurers with teeth, and courts that spot patterns early enough to change behavior. Our task next is to map that corridor, how pressure escapes containment, and how numbers that once lived off-book become unavoidable. That conversion decides everything? Before a hero steps onto a rooftop in The Boys, there's a room few people ever see. It looks ordinary, a whiteboard, a camera, a coach with a binder. What is happening there is not combat training, it is identity training. Institutions use workshops like this to build a stable who behind the logo, because a profitable brand needs a predictable person. The exercise is not mysterious. It is message discipline, a few core lines, a personal myth, and 2 or 3 emotions that the audience should associate with the name. The mechanics are basic, but the effect is large. A trainer will map a hero's life into repeatable beats. Humble origin, hard lesson, renewed purpose. Those beats are not only for social media. They shape interviews, charity events, even how a rescue is described for the press. This helps explain why different heroes start to sound the same. When the stakes are corporate, variance is a risk. Message discipline reduces the chance of off-brand improvisation becoming tomorrow's headline. In practice, that means learning a talk track and the bridges that keep it intact. If a reporter asks about collateral damage, a trained hero pivots to a rehearsed value, then cites a charity initiative with a tested slogan. That detail reveals the tool's true purpose. The goal is not to answer the question. It is to land the feeling the brand bought. Public relations firms teach the same cadence to executives and politicians because the mechanism is shared. Emotional beats convert scrutiny into affinity, which later converts into sales. The Boys shows these sessions as awkward, even dehumanizing, but the logic is clean. People are more forgiving when they feel they know you, and knowing is manufactured here through controlled vulnerability. The spontaneous confession on a stage, the shaky voice at a faith expo, the childhood anecdote told in perfect 30-second arcs, each is a product decision. It exists to make a volatile personality legible and bankable. The important point is not sincerity. It is predictability across platforms. Costume and choreography finish what the words begin. A brand lives in shapes and motions you can recall without thinking. So suits are not only armor, they are logos you can wear. Cuts, textures, and color blocks are chosen for thumbnail legibility and tie-in manufacturing. Fight stances become signatures because a recognizable silhouette travels across billboards, game models, and toys. This is product design applied to moving bodies. In other words, the body is the package. Camera grammar locks it in. Hero landings face the lens at a height that flatters the emblem. Light catches the cape so the icon reads in a single frame. Choreographers time a punch to align with the score cue, already earmarked for a trailer. That detail tells us something important. Scenes are built for recall, not only for realism or tactics. The fight must work as a looping clip on social media where, as scholars like Christian Fuchs argue, our viewing and sharing become unpaid micro-labor that platforms convert into advertising value. The same logic governs training for stillness. Heroes practice how to stand on a podium, how to hold silence after a question, and how to smile with their eyes while ignoring a heckler. These are not mere niceties. They are crisis tools. A calm posture can deflate viral outrage, and a photo with the right expression becomes a compressible asset for sympathetic headlines. In The Boys, you see it in how easily a gaffe is reframed with a new shot and a caption. The image is a lever that resets the narrative. Underneath the glamour sits a pragmatic metric, brand recall. Teams run small tests before big moves. 2 suit designs go to limited audiences. The one with higher instant recognition wins. Trailer editors cut 3 variants of the same beat, each with a different rhythm of impact. Then A and B test watch time against abandonment. This is not a violation of creativity. It is a choice to treat creativity as a variable to optimize. The dashboard decides what feeling ships to market. That is where the pleasure to labor pipeline appears. Think of the Pinocchio image that media critics often invoke. Pleasure Island turning boys' indulgence into donkeys. The metaphor endures because the mechanism persists. We click a teaser for enjoyment. The click is data. The data becomes a proof point in a deck that secures more budget. Our pleasure becomes labor that markets the next product to us. Fuchs calls this disguised, unpaid labor because our browsing and posting create value that platforms and studios later monetize. The Boys makes that pipeline visible by embedding it into the hero's workday. Rescues are staged where cameras can gather content, not always where effectiveness would be highest. Why would a corporation act that way? Because the unit of value is not lives saved. It is audience retained. If a more cinematic approach boosts sentiment by 10 points among key demographics, the system will lean toward the cinematic. This helps explain why certain disasters in the show feel designed for highlight reels. The spectacle is not a byproduct. It is the business. None of this happens without labor, and not just heroic labor. There are stylists who engineer effortless hair against wind shear. There are writers who punch up the same 3 lines to sound fresh in 10 different interviews. There are choreography teams who reduce injury risk while keeping the silhouette memorable. Scholars like Eileen Meehan have argued that, in conglomerated Hollywood, doing business means constructing shows to fit business needs. That framing clarifies why the craft seems standardized. The show is built to clear a market, not to chase a muse. But Meehan also invites a question about the black box called business needs. Who defines them, and who gets paid when they change? Here the hierarchy matters. Executives and owners set incentives in ways that shape workloads on the ground. The writer asked to soften an edge for toy licensing is not inventing the constraint. They are obeying an investment model. This helps explain conflict between creative departments and marketing. It is not a clash of tastes so much as a clash of accountability. The one is measured in resonance, the other is measured in sell-through. The training also covers emotional labor, which becomes profitable when it comes across as authenticity. Media coaching teaches how to cry on cue without blotchy redness, or how to share a safe secret that humanizes without creating liability. Why invest in this? Because parasocial intimacy, our sense of closeness to public figures, correlates with engagement. Higher engagement lifts algorithms, which lifts discovery, which lifts revenue. The chain is tidy. The person becomes a workflow moving through metrics. Fans are part of that workflow. We think we are only sharing excitement or irritation, but our reactions organize future content. The Boys shows fandom as combustible and crucial. Watch parties, memes, and debates generate free distribution, which is why studios feed them with perfect morsels. An anthemic line, a freeze frame of righteous fury, a cameo that detonates on cue. These are not random. They are engineered to recruit us into the marketing team without a paycheck. The platform architecture finishes the job by rewarding what keeps us scrolling. There is another layer, corporate synergy. A punch is choreographed to land on a beat that later anchors the soundtrack single. A suit redesign introduces color accents that match a toy line already prototyped. A narrative detour sets up a theme park experience where you can train with your favorite hero. This is not hidden. It is the business model. Themes, images, and moves are built to travel across products. The result is a revenue stack, where the same emotion is sold multiple times in different forms. The Boys nods toward this with fake ads inside the show. Cereals, energy drinks, charity campaigns. Each product offers the comfort of alignment. Consume and belong. The important point is not hypocrisy. It is how synergy organizes the creative calendar. Release windows, tour schedules, and retail partner timelines all backsolve into story beats. If a single cannot slip, a character arc shifts to accommodate the drop. That detail explains why certain story moments feel both sudden and somehow inevitable. The calendar is the outline. For every polished moment, there is also a rule book, the brand Bible. It sets the vocabulary, the banned phrases, the acceptable shades of rebellion. Heroes study it because misphrased spontaneity can cost millions in licensing. Ownership runs through that book. The likeness, the name, the catchphrases. These are intellectual property entries that the company controls. In practice, it means the person inside the suit can be replaced, but the brand persists. The mask is the asset. The human is a contractor with deliverables. If that sounds cold, consider the legal tools that enable it. Morals clauses and non-disparagement terms keep wayward conduct from staining the license. Training is designed to prevent breaches before enforcement is needed. Why so much discipline? Because mistakes now cascade across the whole stack. A scandal can crater affiliate deals, soundtrack placements, and park attendance forecasts. The cost is systemic. That is why identity work is not an optional gloss. It is risk management welded to sales. The show's self-awareness matters here. Superhero texts have long winked at their own branding. The Boys takes that reflexivity and turns it into a plot engine. That reflexivity also has a real-world function. Self-aware branding often inoculates critique by acknowledging it first, then stylizing it. As some critics of the Age of Ultron era observed, corporate marketing can channel our unease into renewed loyalty by making the critique feel included in the product. The tension becomes a feature, not a bug. The system learns from our complaint and sells us the improved version. Data tightens the loop. Sentiment analysis parses our posts into green, yellow, and red heat maps. Showrunners are briefed on which character expressions spike sharing. Trainers adjust a hero's delivery for the next press cycle based on last week's watch time decay. This helps explain how authenticity gets standardized. What begins as one person's quirk converts into an approved cadence for an entire roster. The human texture that draws attention becomes a template that can be rolled out on schedule. The cost is not only creative, it is also personal. Emotional labor has a body price. Holding a safe tear for an hour under lights is work. Smiling through contempt is work. Bearing the risk of a live appearance, where one unscripted sentence can trigger days of crisis management, is work. Yet in a corporate frame, much of that cost is invisible until it appears as measurable loss. The economics teach everyone to endure it quietly. The brand's needs are treated as natural. The person's limits are treated as negotiable. If fans' joy becomes marketing labor, and heroes' feelings become saleable texture, where does ownership settle? Contracts make one answer plain. The mask, the moves, the lines, and the story universe are someone's property. The person beneath may own their labor, but not always the identity that labor made valuable. The boys keep circling that tension without neat resolution. It is not an accident. There is money in the gray zone where personality blurs into product. Choreography spells it out in concrete steps. A hero enters right, turns 3/4 to camera, pauses on the emblem, and cedes the center to an affiliate who needs lift. That choreographic generosity is not pure altruism. It is brand portfolio management. When a lesser-known character receives framing in a top-tier scene, the studio is seeding the next spin-off asset. This helps explain crossovers that seem narratively thin but visually emphatic. They are there to transfer equity across the slate. Even the failures are processed. A botched rescue becomes a redemption arc with sponsor-backed community service. The same cameras that captured the mistake capture the amends. Why does this work? Because the identity machine already has a template for contrition. The shirt color is softened. The pace of speech slows. The eyes hold contact 6 beats longer. Data suggested that was the sweet spot for forgiveness. The choreography of feeling becomes as routinized as the choreography of flight. For viewers, this can feel cynical, yet it is clarifying. The show is not only telling us that corporations brand power, it is showing how the branding is built, measured, and defended as an investment. Once you see the steps, you can spot them in advertising, politics, and influencer culture. The important point is not to sneer at the tools. It is to understand their incentives. Tools optimized for retention will standardize personality. Tools optimized for synergy will time emotions to product cycles. Tools optimized for liability will script contrition. There is one more twist. Workers inside the system are not all aligned with its goals. Some push back. Writers argue for messier truth. Trainers refuse to polish a lie. Marketing teams sometimes champion risk when numbers favor safety. That internal friction is real and worth noting. It shows that business needs are not fixed laws, but negotiated outcomes. Yet as long as revenue models reward smooth predictability and immediate lift, the default will drift toward polish. The gravity well points toward product. Which brings us to the quiet question, humming under the spectacle. If the corporate machine builds the who, and the who sells across screens, shelves, and parks, who owns the person behind the mask, and their mistakes? The next turn in our story depends on that answer, because in The Boys, identity is both armor and contract, both performance and collateral. Understanding how that contract is enforced will tell us who pays when the choreography fails, and who keeps selling when it works too well. When we widen the frame from brands to institutions, the scale itself changes the stakes. Researchers have long noted that companies like Shell and Walmart operate with budgets larger than the gross domestic product of many countries. One famous shorthand puts it bluntly: among the top 100 economies, roughly half are corporations, not nations. That detail reveals why corporate storytelling often reaches beyond marketing. If you are managing resources at that scale, narrative is not just image care. It is a tool for steering rules, budgets, and priorities that look a lot like public policy. This helps explain why The Boys moves from viral clips to hearing rooms. Once a firm's value chain depends on access to public systems, influence shifts from the marketplace to the rulebook. Media plays a bridging role here. Access-dependent newsrooms, cross-ownership among studios and networks, and audience habits create filters that suppress antagonistic truths. Manufacturing consent, the media model coined by Herman and Chomsky, names this mechanism. When outlets rely on corporate access and advertising, stories that threaten that relationship quietly lose oxygen. Paratexts are the quiet hardware of this ecosystem. Media scholar Jonathan Gray argues that trailers, junkets, toys, and featurettes teach us how to read a story before we meet it. Corporations build these on-ramps to pre-chew interpretation, then replicate the framing across platforms. In The Boys, Vought's film slate, reality shows, and the Vought News Network operate like that. They do not just entertain. They train the audience in the preferred reading of superheroes as necessary security infrastructure. So later policy moves sound like common sense. The conversion of narrative into policy is clearest when Vought manufactures a problem only Vought can solve. Homelander spreads Compound V internationally, seeding supervillains to make non-corporate threats feel both sudden and existential. The point was not chaos, it was procurement. Frightened lawmakers, briefed with curated footage and talking points, could now justify military integration of corporate heroes. That detail matters because it shows the feedback loop. A PR crisis becomes a policy window, and the contract attached to that window becomes the business model. From there, lobbying logic takes over. The official language is efficiency and partnership, classic public-to-private framing. The operational aim is to align rules with the firm's comparative advantage. In The Boys, that means standardized access to defense budgets, procurement preferences for Vought-certified personnel, and oversight regimes that preserve Compound V as proprietary data. This worked because regulation can be designed to constrain rivals more than incumbents. A law that requires enterprise-grade soup management software, for instance, sounds responsible. It also bakes in Vought's stack as the default. Media filters make this easier to sell. Ownership concentration ties studio, news, and licensing arms into a soft coalition. Sourcing dependence ensures that journalists need Vought's feeds, set visits, and exclusive footage to reach audiences on schedule. Flak operations, legal threats, advertiser pressure, influencer backlash raise the cost of running hostile stories. So when Starlight blows the whistle, the initial public conversation is channeled through Vought's scaffolding of access. The important point is not censorship in a crude sense. It is the architecture of convenience that puts the firm's angle within reach and shoves other angles out of frame. Consumer politics then enters as leverage rather than salvation. Activists often describe boycotts as moral market choices, but organizers like Tony Clark argue they are political campaigns using brands as public relations levers and popular education tools. The difference matters. In the show, competing hashtags, supporting Starlight or rallying behind Homelander, do not just move merch. They pressure executives, unnerve advertisers, and signal to lawmakers which way the cultural wind is blowing. Social platforms turn fandom labor into a real-time barometer that can be weaponized in committee rooms the next morning. Some reformers propose disciplining this machine through shareholder power. Corporate governance advocate Robert Monks argues that because pensions and index funds give ordinary people large stakes, the market could be a proxy for the public good if it has the right information. In theory, that turns ownership into a counterweight against abuse. In practice, the boys shows the constraint and the loophole. Stan Edgar speaks the language of fiduciary duty fluently. If disclosure keeps risk priced in and cash flows stable, investors may prefer credible PR over deep reform. Materiality, not morality, sets the floor. Scale changes the bargaining table either way. A firm that rivals states in budget can shop jurisdictions, pool legal expertise, and offer jobs and security packages to cities hungry for both. In the show's world, municipalities contract for super protection the way they contract for sanitation. That design translates corporate standard operating procedures into local policy without a bill ever passing Congress. What used to be policing becomes vendor management. The accountability path changes with it. Citizens are now customers with service levels, not principals with democratic control. Paratechs keep the transition smooth by editing history in real time. After the Stormfront scandal, Vought reshoots Dawn of the Seven and reframes the narrative so the ideology vanishes, while the franchise persists. That is Gray's point about preferred readings at work. The company teaches the audience how to interpret the event as aberration, not pattern. Trade press briefings then confirm strong brand health, obscuring how the same supply chain of recruitment, training, and ideological laundering remains intact. The contradiction is the feature. It protects the pipeline while appearing to purge it. At the overtly political level, narrative power becomes electoral currency. Vought News Network packages fear cycles and grievance into crisp segments, ready for a campaign stump speech. Politicians repeat the frames for airtime and credibility, while Vought gains a friend in the appropriations room. In The Boys, the congressional hearing on Compound V is shattered by a wave of exploding heads. The horror is a plot twist, but the mechanism is legible. When oversight is punished with spectacular consequences, the new equilibrium favors back-channel deals. Chilling affects our policy by other means. If we map The Boys onto the manufacturing consent filters, the parallels line up. Ownership. Vought integrates studios, news, and licensing around a single balance sheet. Advertising. Brands inside the Vought ecosystem become the funders and beneficiaries of content. Sourcing. Journalists and creators rely on Vought footage, access, and data. Black. Legal teams, influencer brigades, and ad dyers enforce costs on dissent. Ideology. The master frame shifts from anti-communism to anti-supervillain security. Each filter trims contradictory facts. Together, they tilt reality toward the decision the firm would prefer lawmakers to reach. The lingering question is not whether stories matter, but how they scale into rules. The show gives us a test. Watch how a crisis is named, who supplies the evidence, and which fix depends on proprietary control. If all three point to the same firm, PR is already halfway to policy. That detail reveals why debates can feel pre-decided. The arena was furnished by the vendor. And yet, this is also where counterpower begins, because everything that looks like an information problem can be turned into an audit problem. Recovering facts strong enough to resist branded reality requires new coalitions that cut across media, law, and finance. Independent investigators need access to raw data streams, not just official feeds. Insurers and reinsurers can force earlier recognition of risk by pricing catastrophic potential rather than waiting for realized losses. Regulators can require plain language stress testing for narrative-dependent business lines, the way banks must model liquidity runs. Audiences can treat trailers, talking points, and studio featurettes as attempts to pre-interpret the world and ask, what readings are missing, and who benefits if I accept this one? That brings us back to The Boys' core lesson about power at scale. When a company can manufacture the villain, frame the threat, sell the hero, and invoice the state, The line between entertainment and government is a supply chain, not a wall. Understanding that chain does not make us cynics. It gives us a field manual. In the final stretch, we will translate that manual into a practical checklist. How to spot story-to-policy pipelines in the wild, and where levers still exist to interrupt them before they harden into rules. The pieces are already on the table. Vaught's press riser tells us almost everything we need to know about reading the playbook. Stormfront is introduced as a savior, cameras flash, and a CEO voiceover frames the stakes before questions begin. That detail reveals how narration is manufactured first, then reported. In practice, the scene isn't just spectacle. It is a lesson in where to look and what to ask next. Here is the practical lens promised earlier. To read any corporate hero story, start with 4 questions. Who pays, who profits, who narrates, and what costs are made invisible? Each question forces the story off the stage and into the system that funds it. Together they expose how saving the day becomes a product line, and how harm can be externalized while revenue rises. Who pays is about inputs the brand does not highlight. In The Boys, taxpayers underwrite policing, military contracts, and cleanup while Vought captures licensing and streaming upside. In the real world, public money, unpaid fan labor, and undercompensated creative work often provide the raw material for the campaign. This helps explain why glossy narratives can flourish, even when the underlying economics fail the communities involved. Who profits sounds simple, but the stack is layered. Shareholders, senior executives, and rights holders claim the protected upside, while contractors, gig workers, and audiences absorb volatility. Media scholars describe conglomerates as social relations among shareholders, executives, and workers, not neutral platforms. That framing matters because it clarifies why outcomes skew toward capital protection first, then narrative, then narrative, then labor. Who narrates identifies the preferred reading. Jonathan Gray's work on paratexts explains that trailers, bonus features, and press kits teach audiences how to interpret the text before they see it. Trade press, by contrast, reveals how corporations actually deploy intellectual property inside strategy and deals. The gap between the two is diagnostic. If the pitch sells moral clarity while the trades discuss regulatory arbitrage, your interpretation should follow the trades. What's made invisible names the externalities. In superhero language, it is the civilian casualties left out of the highlight reel. In corporate language, it is pollution off the books, displaced risk, or legal intimidation that keeps costs off the income statement. Recognizing externalities is crucial because it shows why the story-to-policy pipeline can produce wins for the firm even as public harms expand. Use the checklist on apology theater. When a brand apologizes, ask whether the narrator controls the forum, whether the remedy changes incentives, and whether independent verification exists. If a CEO reads contrition over a montage, but contracts, pay structures, and enforcement remain intact, the function is reputation management, not accountability. That distinction matters because it signals whether the system will produce the same harm again. Accountability has fingerprints. Structural remedies shift money, power, or rules. Examples include clawbacks, automatic penalties tied to outcomes, third-party audits with disclosure, and changes to who approves risk. Scripts have different fingerprints: selective transparency, time-limited listening tours, or philanthropy, pegged to marketing calendars. When you see scripts without structure, you are watching a cost-effective substitute for reform. The Boys help separate these modes. When leadership stages a media moment to sanctify a new hero, the coverage follows the frame they designed. The mechanism is the same when a corporation posts a mea culpa video, while simultaneously briefing investors that the core strategy is unchanged. The important point is not the tone of the apology, but whether incentives and governance moved. Now apply the lens to branded activism. Many firms adopt clauses that harmonize with their product catalog or market expansion plan. That is synergy. The clause burnishes the brand while opening new segments or neutralizing regulatory pressure. To evaluate it, measure outcomes, not optics. Map budgets, timelines, and performance indicators the way you would a product launch. Ask 5 practical questions of any branded cause. What percentage of spend goes to measurable outcomes versus media? How will the firm report results, and who verifies them? Does the cause target the firm's own externalities, or only downstream symptoms? How does the campaign interact with lobbying, procurement, and tax planning? When the answers point to marketing lift without constraint, the activism is a feature of sales, not reform. Fandom sits at the heart of this economy, and fans hold leverage whether they notice it or not. Engagement is labor when it trains algorithms, spreads paratexts, and compresses customer acquisition costs. That does not make fandom suspect. It makes it powerful. Choosing when to amplify scrutiny, demand disclosures, or withhold attention becomes a strategic decision, not a moral purity test. 2 practical fan levers travel well. First, ask for disclosures at the point of influence. Paid access, gifted perks, contractual embargoes, or affiliate incentives. This helps separate authentic excitement from compensated advocacy. Second, redirect part of your attention to independent coverage that does not rely on access. Gray's paratext point applies here. When the pre-game show is the story, step outside the tunnel. Labor is a second counterweight. Characters created under work-for-hire produce profits that fund legal war chests. Those war chests then oppose union drives, shape contracts, and defend against creator claims, as the histories of Joe Shuster, Jerry Siegel, and Jack Kirby make painfully clear. Supporting worker organizing, credit standards, and residuals is not just moral. It modifies the firm's cost of externalizing creator risk. Regulation is the third counterweight, and it is necessary. Scholars like Deborah Spar point out that non-governmental organizations in media can only ever be a spotlight, sharp, mobile, and intermittent. Effective constraints require floodlight, formal standards, disclosure rules, penalties, and enforcement. Charles Kernanan's experience shows watchdogs can inform citizens, but they cannot replace democratic process. What would regulation tuned for narrative industries look like? Start with pricing externalities. If a platform profits from virality that rewards deceptive paratexts, impose transparency and penalties tied to verified harm. If a studio secures public funds while suppressing labor rights through subsidiaries, tie tax credits to enforceable labor standards and public ledgers of spend. This translates principle into levers. Add procurement guardrails. When public institutions purchase services from firms that convert crisis into sales, require conflict of interest disclosures and independent performance audits. The Boys shows how a televised threat briefing can precede a procurement win. In the real world, bring that pipeline under audit by default. Make the cost of persuasion legible before the contract is signed. Media independence completes the picture. Access reporting will always exist because it solves an information problem for audiences and a distribution problem for companies. The corrective is pluralism. Fund outlets that refuse contingent access, train audiences to value process reporting, and support public interest media with stable revenue. You are not fighting insiders, you are diversifying the map. Next, inoculation by self-aware branding. Corporations often preempt critique by performing the critique, then selling the wink. The fix is disaggregation. Separate the content of the critique from the incentives of the distributor. Cross-check the preferred reading against the trade press, where strategy leaks in plain view. If the trade story contradicts the performance, trust the strategy. Another principle: failure is data. Even films engineered by thoughtful marketing teams can flop. Conglomeration and divestiture pull in opposite directions within the same system. That means windows exist when firms shed assets, rewrite deals, or rethink risk. Moments of weakness are moments for policy and labor advances if coalitions arrive prepared with specific enforceable asks. So, here is a simple field method you can use this week. Step 1. Capture the claim. Save the press release, the trailer, the apology, and any influencer amplification. Note words tied to measurable stakes: safety, equality, community, accountability. Those are promises, not vibes. Promises can be tested. Step 2. Map narrators. Identify who benefits from the preferred reading and who supplies the counter-reading. Paratexts are designed to teach you how to watch. Trade press and financial filings are designed to teach investors how to think. Treat them as parallel texts, then chart the differences. Step 3. Follow the money. Look for public subsidies, tax credits, product tie-ins, and advertising spreads that convert attention into liquidity. Where budgets are opaque, use proxies, hiring bursts, procurement rumors, or earnings guidance. Money flow reveals what the story is for. Step 4. Surface externalities. Look for the costs omitted from the frame: labor precarity, community displacement, privacy leakage, environmental damage, or disinformation spillover. If outside groups have already documented them, treat those reports as the baseline. If not, add questions to your log and return later. Step 5. Test accountability. Translate the company's words into falsifiable conditions: deadlines, reports, audits, penalties. Then choose a watchdog you trust and a reporting calendar you will actually check. Accountability without a clock is aspiration. With a clock, it is a plan. Step 6. Pick a lever. As a viewer, you control attention. As a consumer, you control purchase. As a fan, you control amplification. As a worker, you control skill. As an investor, you control governance. As a citizen, you control law. Choose one lever per campaign and use it deliberately. Step 7. Log outcomes. Treat this like a small audit. Did the narrative move procurement, regulation, or valuation? Did the remedy change incentives? Did externalities shrink? Results matter more than press cycles because they shape what gets repeated next quarter. There is also a personal lens worth keeping. Continuous optimization extracts emotional labor not only from creators, but from audiences asked to keep forgiving. When you feel the fatigue of perpetual rollout, that is a signal the machine is using your patience as a resource. It is acceptable, even useful, to step back and return only when conditions change. That returns us to the question from earlier sections: who owns the person behind the mask, and who pays when choreography fails? The legal answer favors the intellectual property, but the practical answer can be shifted. Credit standards, fair residuals, and collective bargaining turn individual risk into shared governance. Public interest rules transform private apology into enforceable duty. The Boys gives us a user manual wrapped in a story. Vaught's machine is exaggerated, but the mechanisms are not. Brand training socializes identity for recall. Paratexts preload the reading. Trade coverage reveals underlying strategy. Crises become levers. Externalities vanish on cue. The lesson isn't cynicism, it is literacy. So take the checklist with you. Who pays, who profits, who narrates, and what is made invisible. Add the filters for apology theater and branded activism. Recognize your fandom as labor with leverage. Backstop it all with public interest counterweights. Independent media, labor rights, and regulation that prices externalities. If there is a final takeaway, it is simple. Power can be packaged and sold back to us, but only if we accept the box as the thing. Literacy breaks the seal. When you map incentives, surface hidden costs, and choose levers with intention, you keep your values from returning to you as merchandise. That is how a superhero show becomes a tool for real life.